Hello everyone, this is part 25 of What If Naruto Was the Perfect Shinobi, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe, it gives me more motivation. Enjoy. I'm serious, dude. You could so score that chick. Naruto stared at Kiba a moment as the two teenage shinobi walked down the streets in Tanzaku-gai. The town's ancient castle loomed on a high hill, as though to protect the place. However, the historic stronghold had long since been reduced to a mere crumbling ruin, and the town below was likewise steeped in corruption. The Jinchuriki supposed it might have been somewhat poetic that this would be the last stop on the mission to retrieve Tsunade, who was much the same as the town and its castle. A once great kunoichi who had sunk into vice in her own right. The trail had led back westward at Otofuku-gai and carried the search team along a trade route that led here, and Kiba's nose was telling him that Tsunade was still in town somewhere. All that remained was to locate her, and then Naruto's own role would be done. He was now as eager to get this mission over with as he'd been to leave Konoha at the start. Naruto groaned and ran a hand through his hair. Please concentrate on the mission, moron. You're giving me a headache. Kiba had been irritating him with pointless chatter all morning long, rather than keeping his mind on business. First, it had been a long update on what all Naruto's old genin classmates were doing now. The container tried to pretend interest, but he couldn't quite give a s about Kiba's now being on Team Kakashi, or Haruno Sakura's recent interest in medical ninjutsu. He didn't care that Uchiha Sasuke was still an angst-ridden prick, or even that Aburame Shino was still in an induced coma due to being poisoned during the recent invasion, as callous as the latter seemed. He'd known the risks involved with meddling in an Anbu mission. And when the blonde hadn't shown interest in that, the mutt had started barking on about something even worse. I don't get it. You're like, nose deep in hot women and haven't done s about it. The Inuzuka was now obsessed with the idea that Naruto needed to get laid, and seemed more than convinced that Yuga wanted to get between the sheets with him. The blonde couldn't even begin to understand where Kiba had gotten this ridiculous idea, but he'd mentioned it about a dozen times now. Perhaps he'd been awake and had overheard their conversation outside the motel room. For about the 100th or so time that cold morning, Naruto wished that he'd been sent out with Sarutobi or Yugao, rather than having to deal with the mutt's inane blathering. He thought he might have Kiba outline his brilliant conclusion to the Anbu Kunoichi later that evening. Naruto would either score with his vice-captain, or else he would get to see the mutt get neutered. He could live with either outcome. You'll never get it. And don't assume too much about what I haven't done, either. Kiba brightened on the spot and opened his mouth to demand all the miserable details Naruto could recall about the drunken night, but then stopped short. He squinted and looked around the street, smelling at the air with his nostrils open wide. However, his Anbu teammate noticed the target while the Inuzuka was still tracking the scent. A more than well-endowed girl with long blonde hair was heading down the road. She looked to be more or less the same age as the two undercover shinobi, but as she came nearer, Naruto glimpsed and recognized her lace, which had been mentioned in the photograph he'd been given to look at earlier. Oi! There she is! Let's go! Tsunade turned a corner right as Kiba exclaimed out, which wasn't at all needed due to Naruto having seen her well in advance, and so seemed not to hear him. Much like a hound dog on the hunt, the Inuzuka rushed straight past the Jinchuriki in hot pursuit as soon as he located his game, grinning like an idiot all the while. The rookie Anbu scowled and reached out to grip onto Kiba's shoulder as he passed, almost pulling the mutt to the ground as his momentum halted on the spot. The animal trainer glared up at his old genin teammate, who shook his head in the negative and preempted his whining. Pipe down, mutt. No good getting her attention right now. First, we'll go back and report to the Hokage. Kiba was all too willing to chase down Tsunade on impulse, without giving a thought to his own well-being, or to what the Sannin might do to him when called out. Naruto was more inclined to let the third handle his old student, though he would be more than prepared to attack her to protect the old man should the need arise. Kiba pulled loose and made an emphatic arm gesture in the general direction that their target had gone. The Jinchuriki was quite aware that people on the street were now staring at the pair, and made an attempt to will the mutt to shut his mouth and quit drawing attention. He should have known better. F that, she might leave again. Come on, let's trail her ass while we've got the chance. And with that, Kiba was bounding right on down the road again. Naruto threw his hands into the chilled morning air in exasperation and spat out a muttered curse as he rushed to keep stride with the mutt. The canine shinobi did have a certain point, but moreover, the blonde wasn't in the least willing to leave this delicate situation in Kiba's hands. As Naruto rounded the corner, he stepped between two buildings and made a shadow clone. The container commanded the doppelganger to return to the third and report on the newest developments, while he dealt with keeping a leash on the mutt in person. As he moved back into the street, he almost collided with another person rounding the corner. Naruto took a quick look as a good-looking brunette woman swerved to the side with impressive grace to avoid him, considering that she was also cradling a squealing pig in her arms. Excuse me. The woman didn't even take the time to look back at him as she rushed past. The pig in her arms struggled against the sudden movement, however, and centering the swine made her robe sleeve roll up her wrist, exposing a loaded senbon launcher strapped on beneath. Kunoiki, now, that's something interesting. Naruto continued on down the road, headed in the same direction as the brunette. He ran into Kiba again soon enough, as the mutt was grinning on the sidewalk with his perverted leer glued right on the harried Kunoiki's tight backside, his urgent mission cast aside. Not that Naruto was looking as well, however, not at all. The brunette came to a halt down the road a short distance, next to some concrete steps that seemed to lead down into an underground room where some armed thugs were standing guard outside a painted wooden door. Kiba licked his smirking lips as the woman stepped down the stairs and spoke with the guards. He kept staring until she was allowed into the cellar. Kiba. Naruto clapped his hands together twice right next to the mutt's ear. That didn't capture his attention, and then the Jinchuriki glowered and slapped him upside the head. Kiba rubbed at the spot where the blonde had smacked him and glared, but turned sheepish at his teammate's expectant expression and pointed with his thumb towards the cellar. Right, I saw Tsunade-sama going into that building too. But hot damn, I swear this has got to be the best assignment ever. The container's sour look indicated that he didn't agree. Yugao's harsh words about Tsunade had gotten to him to an extent. Naruto had spent so long having other people, in most cases the demon inside him, telling him what he was supposed to think that it was his second nature. Old habits tended to hard, and the blonde still wasn't all too used to his independence. Naruto recognized the establishment as what it was at once and regarded the place with blatant disdain. That's a gambling den, so she'll be in there a while. Now come on, let's take a hike. He started back down the road, intent on leaving Tsunade to her useless pursuits, but Kiba seemed to glow as he started towards the concrete cesspool and tried to motion Naruto to do the same. The demon vessel didn't move a muscle, and stared at him with his arms crossed. Nah, I've got me a better idea. Let's go inside. The Jinchuriki could have rammed his spiked head into the nearest wall, and almost sent his snakes out to put the mutt on a leash and drag him out. Naruto was now thinking that he had liked Kiba a whole more when he was an obedient lapdog who wouldn't question him or argue with his decisions. The third strict orders not to blow his cover one out, however, and Naruto set out to catch the Inuzuka again while massaging his temples in a rather vain attempt to dispel the oncoming migraine. You weren't brought along to get ideas, mutt. Forget it, we're leaving. Look, all we've got to do is clean her ass out at the table, and then she'll owe us big and have no choice but to listen to the old man. Naruto sighed and ran a hand through his hair, amazed that he even needed to explain this. Those are seasoned hustlers in there, Kiba. You'll be the one taken to the cleaners. Rather than being deterred, Kiba took the muttered comment as a sign that Naruto had at last capitulated and he grinned again. Don't be such a limp dude. This'll be simple as cake. Like I said, I've got a plan. The blonde tossed his hands in the air and looked to the skies in exasperation. Perhaps losing his ass would show the moron to listen to good advice. Kiba almost strutted as he made towards the guarded door, with a glowering Naruto a step bend. The three thugs paid the two teenagers little heed, ignoring them until it became obvious that the two Konoha nin weren't going to acknowledge the obvious hint and leave. At last, one goon looked over to them with a sneer and spat at the ground as he shouted at them. TCH. Get lost, punks. This ain't no damn kiddie care center. Kiba reached into his pocket and whipped out a thick bankroll. The mutt had gotten paid in advance on this mission, which was listed as S rank due to its immeasurable importance to Konoha despite the minimal risk involved. ANBU members received regular salaries rather than individual mission compensation, coupled with lucrative hazard bonuses when applicable, and so Naruto hadn't gotten paid and was getting a little irritated with being broke. Oi, we've got the cash to lose, and we want to gamble. The lead thug snatched the cash and examined it a moment, and then tossed it back to Kiba with a grunt. Then tough S. This isn't enough. See, this here's a high-stakes casino, and it's a 300,000 ryo minimum to walk in the door. Naruto moved in next to Kiba and rolled up his sleeve to expose the Kusanagi. The guards all brandished their weapons in response, to which the Jinchuriki reacted with a little sneer. These weak imbeciles would neither have seen nor heard the blonde coming had he wanted a mess. Rather than drawing the sword, however, he held out his modded braca to the guards, inviting them to take the weapon themselves. Perhaps it might sear them to a crisp, perhaps not. Naruto didn't quite care. Then hold on to this blade as collateral. I can promise, it's worth much more than that. Letting this peerless weapon into some gangster's hands might have seemed to be an insane idea, but Naruto knew better. Kusanagi was his now, and it would return to him no matter what. Besides, he could K these goons and reclaim it with no problem, should he have to. The weapon sent a disapproving pulse through his arm, as it seemed to know that Naruto was planning to use it as gambling collateral. However, the whole scenario was rendered moot when the door opened and a strong voice rang out. No, that won't be needed. Please, come right inside. An aging, but tough-looking man dressed in expensive clothing stepped outside the cellar into the light, and the three goons all bowed low to him. Boss. The boss, Naruto supposed, dismissed his underlings and motioned the two shinobi inside. The interior was much nicer than the run-down outside. The older man ordered the person managing the casino's assets to measure out a large sum to give to Naruto and Kiba. The ANBU's suspicions were now on maximum alert, as would expected, but the mutt instead seemed quite willing to take the cash, and his sharp grin widened more and more as the attendant heaped more large bills onto the pile. Hey, thanks a bunch, mister. Kiba scratched behind his head with a sheepish smile, remembering too late that he didn't know the man's name. The name's Wasabi Jiriko, kid. I own this casino. Jiriko next turned to Naruto and looked him over, and then nodded as though making his mind up about something. You must be the person who wrecked Gator's operation and put him in his grave. I've heard a lot about a blonde-haired shinobi with strange markings on his cheeks. You've managed to earn quite the reputation in this region. The blonde's expression turned hawkish, and he almost went at his sword, thinking that he might be dealing with an ex-associate that had lost big on Gator's M. The last thing he wanted was to have to get serious with Tsunade sitting in the next room, and he cursed his own thoughtlessness in being inveigled into this strange place, as well as his neglecting to put on a simple henge. Even the mutt had managed that much, as he now had one covering his red Inuzuka stripes. Assuming he had to ruin his mission over this, he resolved to carve his lost compensation out in S-Yakuza. Naruto's voice was as hard as stone as he replied. I'm Yagami Tensai. That little pig tried to have me assassinated on a mission. I didn't much like that. Naruto wasn't about to hand his real name out, and hushed Kiba with a stern look. The proprietor saw right through the shinobi's suspicions, and took on a placating tone. Nevertheless, there was something intoxicating in knowing that his exploits had become known well outside his home village. The Jinchuriki wondered whether he might have his own page in some other shinobi village's bingo book now. No need to be alarmed, son. I'm no Yakuza, and I'd never do business with SC like Gato. You've done the Wasabi, and me, a great service in stomping that roach's guts. Now, I've got another honored guest here this morning. Come with me, please, and I'll introduce her. Jiriko started towards the inner room, gesturing to the two teens to come with him. That's got to be. Naruto silenced Kiba with an outstretched palm, in the same manner as he'd watched the third do to others on countless occasions, the container included. His blood pounded in his ears in anger, due to his being pulled into a compromised position like this. Naruto put on a henge to conceal his whisker marks, and hoped that the proprietor would either not notice, or not make an issue about it. His short response to Kiba came out in a low hiss, as his cursed seal ached in time with the quick throbbing in his head. Not a word, mutt. You got us both into this mess, so don't go making it even worse. Kiba paled a bit and took a step back. Naruto blinked and shook his head, placing one hand to his brow while bracing against the near wall with the other. The sudden rage passed seconds later, as did the pulsing in his seal. Might as well just go and get this over with. XXXXXXXXXX. Back in Konoha, Uchiha Sasuke sat with his legs crossed on the bed in his hospital room. His previous swelling had gone down enough that he could at least see and speak, owing in no small part to the top-notch medical care he'd received since his battle with Itachi. His wounds had been critical, and he did appreciate the care, but there were others who needed the extra attention as much, and perhaps more. There were times when Sasuke resented his station, as he turned a dismissive glance towards the several bouquets and packages he'd received since his hospitalization had become public knowledge. He looked at his image in the mirror near his bed and traced along the wide gash that crossed his cheek now. Itachi's ring had cut right through almost to his skull, and the wound hadn't quite scarred over, despite several healings with medical ninjutsu. This single mark on Sasuke's pale, delicate skin served as a proper complement to the innumerable mental and emotional scars that lurked beneath. Ya might want to quit picking at that thing, brat, or else it'll never heal right. Sasuke almost growled in response to his current guard's sing-song taunt. That examiner Kunoichi, Mitarashi Anko, was lazing about like a cat in the room's open window, sitting in the sill and thumbing through some trash horror novel. The snake bee had been to his room several times that week and seemed to take some sick pleasure in tormenting him. This time, Anko had taken her sweet damn time in munching her restaurant dango while Sasuke had been made to endure the hospital slop, and had then chucked the paper sack into the wastebasket next to his bed when she was done, where the sweet aroma would linger to tantalize him hours later. You know, I'm sure the village could use some extra help with the cleanup work. Attempting to divert Anko was an ill-advised idea in most cases, and Sasuke should have known better. Rather than leaving as the Uchiha wanted, she abandoned her perch and made towards his small bed with an unsettling grin. True, but the Elder Council insists that the great Uchiha be kept under constant guard. Konoha's last Uchiha tried to steeple his hands together, and then glared at his immobile right arm, which was tied still in a sling. As though Sasuke gave what those old men on the council wanted. The whole lot were useless carrion. The Sharingan user scooted in the opposite direction and crossed his arms again in an attempt to ignore Anko. He hoped that a nurse might come to check on him, and perhaps order the demented Kunoichi out into the hall or something. Sasuke did his best not to show the shudder that ran through him when Anko's shadow loomed over his bedside. The woman's arm around his and pulled him back into her. The Uchiha grunted and struggled against her near stranglehold, but to no avail. The lithe teenager couldn't have overpowered the adult Kunoichi even at peak condition. His attempting to do so with one arm was almost laughable, and Anko didn't hesitate to mock him about it. I heard Itachi didn't even bother to use his Sharingan, either. Talk about embarrassing. He needed no reminder. That had been the greatest insult. Not Itachi's gall in daring to go into the Uchiha district once again, or the savage beating he'd given Sasuke, or even his having desecrated the clan's memorial plaque. His brother hadn't bothered to use the Sharingan, which to Sasuke was an unspoken statement that the bastard still didn't even acknowledge him as an Uchiha warrior. It was the ultimate slight. He bit down the urge to mention Anko's own embarrassment at Orochimaru's hands during the second exam. Pissed as he was, Sasuke wasn't an idiot, and he was quite aware that this lunatic was at his back, and that she might well decide to cut open his tea on a whim. Burning with rage and humiliation, he spoke through gritted teeth. Go and Uzumaki or something. Please. A hot, wet sensation trickled down the Uchiha's cheek and several crimson droplets hit his mattress, staining the white hospital sheets. His heightened emotional state had caused his gash to reopen, and he was now seeping blood. Sasuke's gut lurched when the older Kunoichi nuzzled against his whispering poison into his ear. His groin tightened and he dared to hope that the taunting bee wouldn't notice due to his loose hospital robes. Oh, I'd love to, but he's gone right now. Naru-chan's been sent out on an S-rank mission with none other than the Hokage. Sasuke recognized this as an attempt to rile him even more, but he still reacted. Uzumaki Naruto's recent undeserved successes remained a sore topic with him, even though he had larger issues to deal with in Itachi's sudden return. Sasuke couldn't stand seeing that low-class thug handed a position in an elite Anbu squadron at 13 while he, the last Uchiha heir, remained stuck on a genin team. Even worse was the knowledge that a match between the two would end with him unconscious on his back. Anko let out a low, rumbling chuckle and released Sasuke, who coughed and inhaled a deep breath. His reprieve was short-lived, however. The same arm that had been near choking him a moment earlier clamped down into his shoulder and pulled him down onto the bed. Damn it, let me, MMPH. Anko's hand covered Sasuke's mouth as the kunoichi wrenched his head to the side and pressed him down into the mattress. Her shadow loomed over him, and his own blood leaked down through her hand into his mouth as he struggled to get loose. The acrid tang mixed in with her skin's sweet taste, and the combination was almost enough to make him retch. Anko removed her hand and switched it with the other, and cooed in her most lethal voice. But I still haven't had dessert. And I've heard that noble blood tastes better. The crude slurping sound that accompanied Anko's taunting words did make the bile rise in his tea, as the woman licked his blood clean on her hand. Sasuke almost pitied Naruto, who once had to train underneath this thing. Those two had to be a match made in hell. The woman's saliva-coated hand threaded into the Sharingan uses raven hair to pull him back to a sitting position, and she leaned in towards his beak cheek and licked at her lips. The shiver that ran through the teenager wasn't all disgust this time. An irritated drawl interrupted her attempted meal, however. That'll be quite enough, Anko. You've got a student to corrupt, leave mine alone. Sasuke had never been more relieved to see Kakashi, who stood in the entrance staring hard at Anko. The snake kunoichi took a moment to evaluate the situation, and decided not to risk having an issue with Konoha's strongest Junin elite. Anko grinned over at Kakashi and let the Uchiha loose, though the kunoichi raked her knuckles across his scalp hard enough to make him wince as she did so. Bah, you're as much a spoilsport as ever, Kakabaka. Fine, I'm outta here. Anko made towards the window and leapt down to the ground outside, sparing Sasuke neither a glance nor a word. That had been nothing but some stupid, twisted game. The raven-haired genius was almost apoplectic with rage, both at being made to look a total idiot, and at needing Kakashi to rescue him a second time. He seethed and glared at the open window that the examiner had exited through, hand clenching in and out in anger. At least no one else had seen it. That mongrel Kiba would have never let Sasuke live this incident down. I despise her. Kakashi nodded in understanding and reached onto a mounted rack near the door to grab a small towel and tossed it to his student. Sasuke caught the white cloth using his mobile hand and wiped his beak cheek. Dwell on it in training, then. I've pulled some strings here, and you're being released. Sasuke smirked and loosed the sling around his arm, tossing it across the room. He hadn't needed much to begin with, and his arm was in working order save some soreness. Kakashi tossed a small bag onto his student's hospital bed that contained his usual clothes. TCH, it's about time, I'm not even hurt that much. The silver-haired shinobi turned towards the open window in a bid to allow his student to change his clothing in peace. Well, that's nice, but don't expect it to last too long. From here on out, I'll be removing the kid gloves. Remember what Itachi said. No more second chances. Sasuke damn well remembered. There was no chance that he couldn't have. He'd spent his entire time in the hospital brooding over his mouse brother. He hadn't expected to run into the man again. He'd gone to the Uchiha monument to beg his kin to watch over him in combat when the attack had occurred, and Itachi was there, holding the new plum blossoms Sasuke had placed earlier that morning in his departed mother's honor, crushed in his hand like garbage. Even though his brother hadn't acted in the least surprised to see him, he knew that the meeting had been coincidence. Itachi hadn't come to seek him out. His traveling through the abandoned Uchiha district was a mere shortcut to his actual planned destination, or perhaps his actual target would be more accurate. Uzumaki, again, always him, everything seems to revolve around that bastard. Sasuke had overheard certain grumbling rumors during his incarceration, that his brother had outright said that he and his allies had come in order to capture Naruto right as the Nukenin squadron prepared to retreat. He also remembered that during his exchange with Kakashi, Itachi had admitted that he had come back to retrieve the fourth Hokage's heritage, and that damaging the village was nothing but icing on the cake. Sasuke had passed a good time wondering about that, as he digested the medic's gossip that he'd managed to listen in on. There was a certain resemblance between the Yondaime and Naruto, and thus some chance that the two were related, but the brooding Uchiha was convinced that there was more to it than that. His brother was several things, but he was neither sentimental nor stupid. Itachi would never have dared a return to Konoha unless his reason held some immense value to him. The connection between Uzumaki and the fourth had to be something else, something that would attract Itachi's personal interest. I won't need another chance. Next time, I'll be prepared to avenge the clan. The raven-haired genin began to muse about his limited knowledge concerning Uzumaki Naruto, and there wasn't much. Sasuke remembered what he'd learned on asking that pathetic weakling in the glasses during the Chunin exams about the blonde, and despite Kabuto's bragging about his cards, there had been almost nothing in his intel about Naruto. His birth date and mission count were all that Kabuto had been able to reveal. There was nothing much interesting there, save the trivial coincidence that he had been born on the exact same night that the fourth had killed the demon and saved Konoha, at least as all the stories told. And at that exact moment, he solved the riddle. Uzumaki Naruto was a Jinchuriki. He was the living container to the nine-tailed demon fox, or perhaps he was the demon reincarnate, reborn in the Yondaime's own image. The revelation hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest, and Sasuke stumbled against the nearest wall. It's so damned obvious. I can't believe I missed it for so long. He could have been mistaken, and it could all be coincidence, but the entire scenario made too much sense, and explained too much. Sasuke had never quite gotten the rationale driving the sheer contempt that the villagers held towards Naruto until then, as he'd never noticed the blonde doing much to provoke it. His being a demon container also helped to explain his radical potential as a shinobi, as well as the Sandaime's vested interest in his career. An obscene power like that made even the Sharingan look mundane in comparison, and Uchiha Sasuke envied Uzumaki Naruto more than ever. He could kill Itachi and avenge his clan with no problem, had he such a weapon at his disposal. And now his brother seemed to want to manipulate that same power. The Sharingan's original purpose was to control the demon fox according to the Uchiha clan's most secret records, though Sasuke doubted whether such a thing was even possible. No mortal could make that raging monster do his bidding. Itachi, however, seemed to believe in the legend. Sasuke snapped back to attention and glared at Kakashi, who stood watching him with a neutral expression. The listless pervert had been the fourth student in the past, and the raven-haired shinobi almost broached the topic with his sensei, but then reconsidered the idea, doubting that Kakashi would tell him a thing. Perhaps he might ask later, when the two were alone. There had to be some important reason that Naruto's problematic situation had been kept a secret, and Sasuke was certain no one else in their age group knew the truth. He intended to keep quiet about it too. This knowledge held an immense value that wasn't to be squandered on some stupid impulse, not to mention that opening his mouth could bring about dire consequences, given Naruto's close-knit status with the Hokage. It's nothing. Let's go. The sooner I can get back into training, the better. Kakashi nodded and resumed his deliberate walk down the corridor with Sasuke trailing right behind. For now, he would concentrate on honing his own SKS. He could do nothing with his new knowledge on Uzumaki until the blonde returned to Konoha, and he had to improve as much and as soon as possible. Though Itachi might have made his demands in order to push Kakashi into increasing their training regimen, Sasuke had no doubt as to the truth behind them. He'd receive no more reprieves, and the next encounter between the Uchiha brothers would result in one's death. He would thus master his bloodline, and in doing so, gain the power he needed to overcome Itachi, as well as to unravel the truth about the Sharingan's supposed true purpose. XXXXXXXXXX. Kiba's little stunt hadn't turned out to be quite the epic disaster Naruto had expected. The mutt was even doing quite well at the poker table, as his cash pile was the second largest in the room, under Tsunades. The Slug Princess, true to her other moniker, hadn't managed to win even a single hand to the current point, but she had started with a much larger cash pool and had stuck to making rather conservative bets, so that she still had a huge sum to gamble. Tsunade had adopted a more adult appearance at some point, as she no longer appeared the teenage girl Naruto had seen in the streets earlier. The blonde was most impressed with her precision, as he couldn't detect the subtle chakra, aura, that indicated a henge around her at all. Personal demons aside, she deserved her reputation. The other gamblers in the room grumbled as Kiba laid down a straight and took the present hand, scooping the winnings back into his large pile with an arrogant grin. Hey, the idiot actually does know what he's doing. Amazing. There was more than sheer dumb luck involved, though that too seemed to have its own role. Kiba hadn't done as well on the opening hands, and Naruto had been convinced he'd lose the whole pile, but as the cards continued passing through his hands, the mutt's luck seemed to improve. The Jinchuriki hadn't quite understood it, until he caught Kiba dipping into some strange metal canister at his waist. He was marking the cards as he held them using a chemical that a normal human's, or even a shinobi's, nose would never be able to detect. Naruto didn't quite get all the particulars, but the mutt now knew more or less what cards the other patrons were holding at all times. Bah! Damned kid's luckier than a devil. A bearded nobleman groused at Kiba's luck, as the dealer passed out the next hand. The red insignia adorning his luxurious robes indicated that he was related to the Fire Lord, perhaps a brother or cousin to the great daimyo. The people sitting in this den were all rich and well connected enough to cause problems, should the mutt get caught at his present game. Naruto wondered whether soon it was onto Kiba, but the large bed hokage to be sipped at her sake in calm silence while contemplating her cards. Meanwhile, her attendant, the kunoichi whom he had almost bumped into in street, was looking right at the blonde with a contemplative expression. Naruto didn't doubt in the least that both Tsunade and her attendant had seen right through both his henge and the mutts. Neither woman had made an issue about it, however, and Tsunade hadn't reacted in the least, save a narrowed glance at Naruto when the two shinobi had entered earlier. TCH, I'm out. I've got no luck this time. A rich-looking merchant who was among the gathered decided to cut his losses when he received his hand, and pulled out rather than lose more. Naruto glanced at Kiba's mismatched cards. He had nothing this time. Rather than opting out, however, he matched Tsunade's small bet and tossed out 3 cards. The Jinchuriki agreed. Better to lose some here and there, and maintain the illusion that the two shinobi were honest. He'd rather not have the other participants suspect cheating. For Kiba, this seemed to be routine. Naruto had heard that the mutt had sometimes run poker games during outdoor recess as a cadet, and now it seemed apparent that he'd used this little scam once or twice in the past. He'd ended up with a single pair upon being dealt his replacements, but the nobleman still won the hand with 2 pairs. Tsunade had nothing in hers, but didn't seem much too bothered with her poor luck. That, too, was routine. Her attendant was still peering at Naruto with that same questioning look. Yeah, she definitely knows something. Naruto returned her attention with something resembling a disarming smile. The woman held onto his stare long enough to make a distinct point, and then looked elsewhere. Kiba received a good hand, and proceeded to regain what he'd lost in the previous with decent interest stacked on top. For the next hour or so, the game continued on like so, and more people began to either tap out or quit in exasperation. No one voiced an accusation, however, as there was no clear evidence to prove that the two teenagers were cheating. Not that it's really even cheating, I guess. Naruto and Kiba weren't doing a thing to change the cards being dealt, and thus the mutt scheme wasn't outright improving his chances to win. Knowing the odds and rigging them were two separate things, though the Jinchuriki would have had no moral issue with doing the latter as well, were he able to do so without getting busted. Indeed, Naruto would have been the one to go right in and plunder the vault, and not even waste his time with earning the cash on the tables. At least, he might as long as there were no cage-level kunoichi hanging around to grind him into paste, as was the present case. Though that still might happen, I wish the Hokage and Azuki could hurry their asses up and get here. The sooner this entire mess was resolved, the better. The game was now down to 2 people, Kiba and Tsunade. Both had about the same amount in their respective cash piles. The mutt's repeated wins and the Sannin's ceaseless losses had both had a cumulative impact. Naruto looked at Kiba's hand as he received it, and it was a sure winner. The mutt had 2 pairs, aces and 8s. The Inuzuka couldn't hold back his grin. Tsunade looked at him with irritation, and in a move that surprised both teenagers, pushed all her remaining cash into the center. Kiba's incredulous expression indicated that she had S in her hand. He wasted no time in calling and shoved all his winnings in 2, tossing his one mismatched card in to be replaced while she cast down 3. Naruto was no expert poker shark, but even he was able to see that Tsunade had lost her temper and blundered. Densetsu no Kamo indeed. Kiba's grin turned downright arrogant when he got his replacement card, a third ace. Hey, read, and weep, sweetheart. The Jinchuriki repulsed the urge to sneer at the trite line, and instead imagined what he might do with his share in this massive pot. His stake would make a nice deposit on a new apartment, and a good one at that. He'd be able to escape living in the slums in Konoha at last, and all on the Shodai's inheritance. However, that all came crashing to a halt when Tsunade smirked and put her own cards on the table. 4 queens. The mutt hadn't bothered to check what she had been dealt as replacements, so assured he was in his invincible hand. And Sir even Kiba, who'd been reading the odds all along, was reduced to stun shock when he lost the whole game in a single decisive hand. He needed several moments to regain his voice, during which time the Kunoichi smirked and shoveled her massive winnings over to her side while Naruto's hands tingled with the need to throttle him. Almost 6 million ryo, enough to retire on at 13, was gone. Or, S on a stick. Tsunade saw how put out the two were, and decided to grind a little salt into the wounds. Ha! Tough luck, brats. Remind that old chimpanzee to make sure his drones can gamble right next time. Kiba reddened with rage, and Naruto thought that he might have to hold the mutt back. He too wanted to bust the gloating old bee in the chops, suicidal though the notion was. Tsunade's attendant looked rather embarrassed with her mistress's attitude and wouldn't meet either teenager's gaze as she set the pig down on the ground and began to scoop the slug princess's winnings into an expansive leather bag. Neither Konoha Nin had a chance to respond to her, however, as a new voice entered into the conversation. You can be certain he'll take that expert advice into consideration, Tsunade. Tsunade at once looked as though she'd swallowed raw sewage. Her sensei, the third Hokage, was standing in the casino's entrance and regarding her with an amused grin. Naruto almost expected to see the Yakuza guards SD to pieces, as Yugao was lingering a step behind Sarutobi and looking rather displeased with something. Tsunade pinned her old master with a withering glare, and slammed her palm down against the poker table. The polished wood shattered beneath her monstrous strength. Oh, I should have known. Forget it, whatever this is. I'm leaving. Let's go, Shizune. Tsunade stormed out past the third, who made no move to stop her. Yugao almost made an attempt to bar the woman's path, but the old Hokage checked her with a stern look. The Anbu glowered at Tsunade's back as she stepped over an unconscious guard and out into the street. The brunette attendant, Shizune, gave an apologetic bow to the sandaime and then gathered up the cash and the pet pig and hurried out to again catch her mistress. I cannot believe her. To show such blatant disrespect to the Hokage, disgusting. Sarutobi cut Yugao's hissing rant short with a tired sigh. I never expected this to be as simple as approaching her and asking. Come, we'd best pursue Tsunade, while she's still sober enough to listen. The third turned and exited the casino, never even having acknowledged Naruto's presence. Yugao took a long look around the place and then cast a withering look at the Jinchuriki and also exited, shaking her head in disdain. He almost pointed towards the mutt, implicating Kiba's starring role in this little adventure, but knew that it would hold no water with her. Naruto was supposed to be in charge, as the higher-ranking shinobi present at the time. More protocol bulls, he was sure. Nevertheless, he almost glared right at Kiba in his own right once the martinet was gone, but stopped short at the mutt's pitiable expression. There was no real point in kicking him while he was down. Naruto's issues with Yugao had nothing to do with Kiba, as she'd been acting rather odd towards him ever since that late-night conversation in the hotel. He didn't know what he'd done to make her so mad, but there was work to be done and no time to dwell on the problem. Quit sulking and get moving. The last thing we need is more trouble. Kiba could do nothing but nod and stomach his beaten pride. XXXXXXXXXX. Sarutobi strolled down the Tanzaku-gai streets with his small entourage in tow. Trailing Tsunade had been a simple matter, as the incensed Sannin had created a virtual storm in her wake. Following the rampant destruction led the retired Hokage and his guards to a luxurious hotel in the town's upscale commercial sector. He noticed her apprentice in the road near the entrance, as though expecting the Konoha group. Shizune hailed the old man and his companions as he led them to her position. Sandaime Sama. The third smiled and looked the brunette over. He could remember so long ago when Tsunade had resigned her active commission and abandoned Konoha, taking her lover's school-aged niece with her. Shizune had grown into both an attractive woman and, according to the aged Kage's extensive intelligence, a stellar medical kunoichi since then. Sarutobi hoped that she would soon have the chance to put those hard-earned skills and knowledge to some real use, rather than wasting them as Tsunde's maid. Though she'd never dare complain about her station, the Sandaime could tell that she desired the same. You look well, Shizune-san. Tsunade has trained a good apprentice. Please take us to her now. I must speak with her. Shizune smiled a little at the compliment, but still bowed again with the same apologetic look as earlier. No doubt, Tsunade's discourteous behavior was an embarrassment to her. The third pitied the woman rather than blaming her, torn as she was between her mentor's capricious demands and what proper conduct required. I do apologize, Tsunade-sama's not willing to receive visitors now. Excuse her rudeness, please. Perhaps she'll be in a better mood later. Sarutobi heard a low snort behind him that could have been either Naruto or Yugao. Neither Anbu was too pleased with his chosen successor, though both had taken pains not to mention such in his direct presence. However, Sarutobi's hearing was still quite remarkable in his old age, and he couldn't help listening to their conversation in the motel's hall the previous night as he'd exited the bath. There wasn't a person alive that Naruto would have been willing to accept as the third's replacement, regardless. Sarutobi almost hated making him kneel to another, loose the lad's one constant in the world, but he had no choice. The old man no longer had the strength to lead, and Konoha would need such strength soon enough. Tsunade had that power within her, no matter how deep in vice she'd steeped, and no matter what Izuki Yugao believed and poisoned Naruto into likewise believing. This is an urgent matter, one that concerns her selection as the Godime Hokage. Shizune brightened at once, ecstatic with the revelation. Tsunade's attendant didn't like having to block them, the Sandaime understood, and all she required was a good enough reason to let them through against her mistress's orders. Ah, that's great news. Please, in that case, come right with me. She beckoned them inside the hotel with a certain spring in her step. Someone let out a harumph behind Sarutobi once the brunette had moved outside earshot, and this time he knew it was Naruto, who no doubt held the woman's sudden enthusiasm in contempt. The third almost turned and reprimanded the teenaged Anbu, but decided against it. He hadn't the heart to be too hard on the blonde, who was coping with so much hardship right now. The Akatsuki attack and losing his home, savings and possessions were but the most recent issues that he had to deal with, while never complaining even a single word. Naruto had nothing but the clothes on his back and the sword on his wrist to his name at present. The Sandaime let him be and instead turned to Kiba as the group entered the hotel's main door. Kiba-kun, please keep watch out here until we return. The dog trainer looked back at him, and nodded without his usual boisterous attitude. Losing that huge pot to Tsunade must have dealt a massive blow to his ego. Sarutobi rather expected that the coming conversation with his old student wouldn't be civil in the least, and he wasn't willing to risk having the Inuzuka pack leader's son learning things he shouldn't. Posting the lad outside, where even his exceptional canine ears couldn't make him overhear the whole exchange, seemed to be the best course. The retired Hokage and his two guards went with Shizune into the expensive hotel, upstairs to the top level, and then Tsunade's apprentice stopped outside a closed door. This is it. I believe she's been drinking, so please use caution. Sarutobi let out a low chuckle, having long since drawn the same conclusion. Shizune opened the door and stood near the entrance, allowed the old man to go through. And as he expected, there were several emptied sake bottles littering the ornate carpet around the slug princess, who sat drinking another in calm silence. Tsunade let out a sigh and looked up when the door opened, but as soon as she saw her sensei standing there next to her attendant, the blonde kunoichi exploded into a violent rage. Damn it to hell, Shizune. I said to tell those assholes to get lost, not to invite them in. Shizune, cheeks crimson with embarrassment, took the abusive tongue lashing with a lowered head as though it were a routine event. Sarutobi's hackles rose a bit as he listened on in silence, but he didn't intervene. The kami knew he had no right to criticize his pupil's conduct towards her apprentice, given his own horrible mistakes as a teacher. Tsunade vented her spleen until she was somewhat sated, and at last the old man moved into the room and sat down opposite her. Yugao leaned against the distant wall and looked down at the sake-riddled blonde with absolute disgust, while Naruto remained lingering outside and wouldn't enter until Sarutobi gestured him, and stood behind his mentor. The Sandaime addressed his errant student with a gentle chiding tone. Now, Now, Tsunade, I seem to recall teaching my student better manners than that. Tsunade leered at her old master through weighted lids. Her perpetual henge slipped a bit in her anger, or she willed it to change, and age lines appeared on her skin, as though she'd lived 2 decades in an instant. The Sannin placed her sake bottle on the ground next to her and hissed at her mentor through clenched teeth, leaning over to stare straight into the smaller man. Fine, let's make this quick then, Saru-sensei. The answer is no. Now leave me the hell alone, so I can get hammered in peace. The third radiated unwavering calm and patience as he met the enraged glare, and took a long, tired breath as he answered. He also noticed Naruto reaching towards his robe sleeve and the weapon concealed beneath, more than willing to behead Tsunade the moment she moved a millimeter nearer to the sage, using her old teammate's sword. The Sandaime didn't doubt that he could, given her near-intoxicated state, and were he to miss somehow, Yuga was sure to be no less prepared to K behind them. You're assuming quite a bit there, Tsunade. Tsunade sneered and took her bottle in hand again, and downed a long swig as she regained some control over her anger. The lines vanished, and her henge slid back into place without a hitch. Please, old man, a little damned credit would be nice. You'd never leave Konoha and hunt me down to reminisce over old times. Sarutobi grinned, having expected Tsunade to discern the reason behind his visit. Perceptive as ever, I see. Yes, that's right. I'll get straight to the point. I have retired as Hokage, and I've come here to retrieve the Godime. The slug princess blinked, and took a long time to respond, but when she did, she broke into mirthless laughter that dripped with scorn. Tsunade mocked the proposal, and the position her sensei had held so long with so much pride. Sarutobi also remembered how much pain the woman associated with the term, Hokage, along with how much she'd lost due to her most precious people seeking the position. He remembered, because he had been most to blame. Tsunade spat at the ground, and likewise spat out her response. Hokage. Bah. I'd have to be a total idiot to want that accursed position. Forget it. I've got no interest in being some useless sheepdog. Shizune shouted out at her mentor, as Tsunade's rude, overbearing attitude was at last more than the brunette medic could stand. Tsunade-sama. The blonde looked up at her scandalized pupil and sighed. Tsunade now seemed to be more exhausted than enraged, and the Sandaime hoped that he might be able to make progress with her now that he'd weathered her temper. Sarutobi had come anticipating an uphill struggle to convince her to return home, and he was prepared to take as long as he needed to succeed. The slug princess sighed again, and massaged her temples in irritation. HMPH, whatever. The answer is still no. Pick someone else who gives AS. The third grunted, wishing like all hell that he had his pipe on hand. He needed a smoke. There are other candidates, but none with the proper lineage to go with the skills needed. You are the ideal choice. In his heart, Sarutobi outright despised the truth in that statement. He had never been the sort to believe that blood ought to matter a damned thing. However, with war now looming, the next Hokage would need to be someone who could keep all the Shinobi clans united and obedient. Konoha needed Tsunade to succeed him. As the Shodai's last living descendant, she had the clout to bring the whole village together, as well as the power to protect Konoha due to her skills and experience. The Eslish clans would not accept a mere upstart. The only other choice was Jiraiya, who would never accept the position, and Sarutobi had tried countless times over the past decade to convince the man. No one else had the experience to take the reins during a war and the strength to protect Konoha as the Hokage must. Given a little more time to season, the current generation's most outstanding shinobi might have made ideal candidates, but there was no time. If only Minato-kun was still alive. The Sandaime's previous argument didn't appear to move Tsunade in the least. She retook her sake bottle and took calm, deliberate sips, as opposed the earlier violent chug. You've got a son, old man. Appoint him to the position, or else. Tsunade gestured towards the quiet Naruto with the bottle, and Sarutobi could sense the Jinchuriki looking down at her with a suspicious expression in reaction. The old man knew what she were about to go, and willed her to be silent, but to no avail. Let Spike back there wear that ridiculous-looking hat instead. He's a Hokage's son too. For a long moment, silence reigned. The third turned around to regard his protégé, who picked at his spiked blonde hair, so much like Minato's, and took on a look so wrought with utter despair it that could have made the old man's heart bleed. Naruto pieced together the truth in an instant, and Sarutobi realized at once that the lad took no pride or pleasure in knowing. The third wanted to be disappointed with him, but couldn't. No matter that what the man had done had saved Konoha, Naruto had been put through so much hardship as a result. The Jinchuriki looked down at his mentor, almost pleading him to tell him that Tsunade was mistaken. Sarutobi would not, and could not lie to him, however. Hokage-sama. Tsunade noticed Naruto's expression too, and her lips quirked into a venomous smile. That shocked look, oh, don't tell me the poor kid didn't even know. You're a right old bastard. Ha, I guess some things never change. The old man stared hard at Tsunade, his patience with the embittered Kunoichi now running thin. The Sandaime didn't mind her hatred towards him, as he deserved it and more, given the mistakes he'd made with her, and how much she'd lost due to them. However, the woman had no right to spit her poison on Naruto, who had done nothing to her. Sarutobi let out a pained groan and turned back to his Jinchuriki charge, who he looked upon as a son as much as his own, resigned to having to tackle this delicate issue now, rather than later in private as he would have liked. Pull out that scroll and smear a little blood and chakra on the seal, please. Naruto remained motionless a long moment, and stared down at the ground. He wasn't reacting well to the news at all. At last, the blonde hurled his hand inside his robes and held the scroll out, and squeezed the docent so hard that Sarutobi worried that he might end up crushing it, pouring his unleashed rage into the rolled paper. However, he mastered his anger somewhat, though the old man couldn't help noticing that his nails had elongated into sharp claws at some point. Naruto bit his thumb and wiped his blood into the seal as instructed, at which point it shimmered and unlocked. Rather than perusing the contents on his own, however, Naruto handed his inheritance over to his master and mentor without a word, as though he were disgusted with the thing. The sage pinned the recalcitrant teenager an irritated look, but examined the scroll nonetheless. Those are, rather than words, or perhaps jutsu instructions, the scroll contained additional scrolls locked within. The old man withdrew the top item, as the interior contents weren't protected with additional seals, and opened it. Naruto looked on, though he tried to pretend not to be interested, and Tsunade continued to sip at her alcohol while observing her mentor and his teenage protege with a domineering expression. Again, there were no techniques outlined within the scroll, but instead, Namikaze Minato's cluttered research notes and personal observations. That was so much like him, the Sandaime mused. Minato wasn't about to let his son have a simple shortcut to inheriting his SKS. Naruto would have to recreate the fourth Hokage's techniques on his own, using the notes as a guide. Sarutobi's aged lips quirked into a nostalgic smile as the old man replaced the scroll and resealed the collection, tossing the lot back to its new owner. These scrolls together represent the fourth Hokage's inheritance. None save those with his blood can break open its sealing mechanism. Naruto glowered and slipped the collection back into his robe. A moment later, he let out a chuckle that seemed somehow inhuman, and exuded a malicious aura so potent that it made the old man's pulse quicken a little, and his chest stir. The Jinchuriki began to perspire, and grabbed at the cursed seal on his end while stumbling down to a knee. His response seemed to be directed towards nothing, as though he was speaking to some invisible presence in the air. I see, so, that's how it is. Dear old dad sealed a demon into me, charming. A little blood seeped out where Naruto's sharp nails were digging into the skin on his end, and his breathing was quite loud and erratic. Tsunade was watching him with a medic's detached interest, curious about his strange behavior and not in the least perturbed. Not that she ought to have been, given the enormous gap in both skill and power there. Shizune, on the other hand, seemed quite worried, while Yuga was measuring the blonde in an attempt to decide whether her subordinate was a threat that needed to be neutralized, though the Sandaime could tell that she hoped he wasn't. Red marks began to show out through the seal to cover his chest, and Naruto's pained grunt indicated that he hadn't willed the Juin to activate. Damn, he's beginning to lose control, this is bad. However, even as soon as the situation seemed to be nearing critical mass, the vile marks retreated back into the seal, and Naruto's condition normalized, with stable though still labored breathing. As he regained control over his mind and actions, the Jinchuriki looked humiliated with his lapse, and wouldn't meet the third's concerned gaze. The old man worried about him more now than he had when Orochimaru had put that mark on him to start. The lad was going to snap at the rate things were going. Naruto. The blonde rose to stand again, and stared down at his blood-stained hand and then shook his head. Naruto hissed and used his other, clean hand to wipe the sweat on his brow. Face red with anger and embarrassment, he turned his attention towards the door and made to leave. Please excuse me, Hokage-sama. I think I might need to go and take a stroll. Naruto waited in place until the old man grunted his tacit approval, and then rushed to leave the room. Yugal watched his movements the whole time, but he didn't seem to notice. Sarutobi waited until the Jinchuriki was well into the street outside and then motioned to his other Anbu guard. Follow him and make certain he doesn't have a relapse. The Sandaime hoped that Naruto had enough sense not to go on some mindless rampage in a public place, but it was better to be certain. Yugal bowed low and disappeared with Shunshin. Meanwhile, the retired Hokage resolved that he would have to examine Naruto's cursed seal later, and to perhaps ask Jiraiya to do the same the next time his perverted student was in Konoha. An ear-splitting noise that sounded like a monster's howl filled the air, causing a low shudder to run through the third Hokage. Tsunade at last emptied her sake bottle and set it down beside her, looking over her shoulder towards where the noise had originated outside. That kid's got some serious issues. The third almost whirled on her with a stern glare, showing the power and presence that had made him renowned throughout their world as Kami no Shinobi. Sarutobi was not pleased with his old student's cattish, immature behavior, and he was through holding it in. He now wished that he had a smoke more than ever, to calm his own building rage. You were pleased at that, I should hope. That was a senseless and cruel thing to do, Tsunade, pulling out his skeletons like that. Tsunade sneered and leaned back on her calves, crossing her arms beneath her ample bosom and choking out a cold snort. Don't sit over there and guilt-trip me, sensei. Besides, I'd be willing to bet I'm not the person the brats are pissed with. Despite the hard tone, the observant Sandaime could tell that Tsunade's snide retort was a mere token gesture, and that she indeed regretted what she'd done to Naruto on accident. However, she was a proud woman who had never been inclined to admit to her mistakes. That much, at least, hadn't changed during the Slug Princess's hiatus. Answer, despite all the Kunoichi had done to hurt him, and Naruto as well, Sarutobi was pleased to see that Tsunade's old manner still existed to an extent beneath that embittered shell. He would haul that person back, to him and to Konoha, no matter how long it took, or how hard the process might be. Redemption was still possible this time, unlike with Orochimaru. I won't sit idly back and let another one fall, not again. Answer, the old Hokage smiled, as all was not lost. This time, he would make good his past mistakes and save his precious person. XXXXXXXXXX. Naruto. Naruto paid no attention to Kiba as he exited the hotel, brushing right past the mutt. The fourth Hokage, Namikaze Minato, his father. The idea was almost too sickening to even ponder, and still, the surprise wasn't quite there, almost as though he had somehow known the truth all along down deep somewhere. He swore that he could hear the demon laughing at him within his subconscious, though perhaps he was imagining it. He'd had to leave that room, couldn't put up with that sneering old Tsunade and her utter disrespect towards the Sandaime a millisecond longer, or else he'd have gone berserk. One thing's for damn sure, I'll go rogue long before I ever call her Hokage-sama. The blonde was starting down the street when a hand clamped down on his shoulder. Oi, hold on a second, man. Naruto saw crimson, and grabbed Kiba's wrist almost hard enough to strain the bone, pulling him around so that the two looked at one another. Leave me. Kiba whitened as he gawked into those crimson SS, a telltale sign that his teammate was in a demonic rage, and when the Jinchuriki released him, he stumbled down onto his rear end and clambered back towards the hotel entrance, pride and shinobi training ignored against the sheer animal instinct that screamed, run. Naruto grinned down at him through razor-sharp canines and turned back in the direction he'd been going. People in the street gave the blonde a wide berth as he passed, and at last he chanced on a small ramen stand that sat against a larger brick building. I'll have a deluxe bowl and some sake, and make it quick. The proprietor was quick to nod in acknowledgement at his rather dangerous-looking patron and start preparing his meal, placing a bottle down at his seat, along with some rice noodles as an appetizer. Naruto's en hurt where his nails had cut into it, and his head was king him. He did some breathing exercises in an attempt to quiet his raging nerves as he drank his wine in deep draughts. He drained about a third, and then Tsunade's sneering, bitter visage came to his mind. The demon container had to repress his own need to vomit as he glowered and shoved the sake bottle to the side, wanting nothing more to do with the rice liquor. He wished he'd ked her back there. He might not have succeeded, and might have even gotten charged with treason, but she would have deserved it. Nobody spoke to the Sandaime like he was some dog. Thinking about it almost made his rage boil over again. Damn it, I just need to calm the F down a little. Naruto's ramen arrived, and his upper lip curled when he took a bite, as the slop tasted like dung compared to what he was used to at Ichiraku's. Or, perhaps the vile taste in his mouth had to do with something else. The blonde couldn't decide quite who he needed to hold responsible. Tsunade had been the one to pop open the chum bucket, but the old man had concealed the mess all this time, and the fourth, dearest dad, had created the problem. Naruto pulled out the Yondaime scroll and set it down on the counter, tempted ever so much to pour his sake on it and set it ablaze. He'd been through too much S over the monster in his gut, and someone had to take the blame. Might as well be the S person. However, the Jinchuriki did nothing except stare at the scroll. The cold air was helping to chill his anger down to a low simmer, as was having a hot meal to eat. That's 3 times I've almost lost it today, Fing seal. Naruto smirked and poked the seal on his end with a chopstick, and hissed when it lanced him with a sharp pain. Almost losing his cool in the casino with the mutt was one matter, but to go spare in the Hokage's presence was inexcusable. Naruto hadn't meant to do it, as he never did, but the issue was something that needed to be dealt with. Not that he had the slightest clue as to how to approach the problem. For that matter, the fourth's notes were useless to him. He didn't know about sealing jutsu. That asshole might have at least been considerate enough to make things easier on his son given how much bulls Naruto'd had to wade through to begin with because his dad was a trusting moron. The Jinchuriki wanted all to do with Namikaze Minato, his name or his heritage. He would speak with Sarutobi later about continuing to keep the matter quiet. Like hell he was ever going to be Namikaze Naruto, the new Yellow Flash, or whatever his bastard sire might have wanted him to become. His own name suited him quite well. I'd better get back now. Now that the rage had passed through him, though he still had more than enough to be mad about, there remained a certain emptiness. Naruto reached into his pocket, realizing much too late that he hadn't a single ryo with which to cover his bill. He took a moment to ponder what he was going to do about this less pressing issue, and was a bit reluctant to have to beg the Hokage or Yugao or even Kiba to spot him some cash. A shadow loomed over his position and something light tapped against his shoulder. Naruto sucked in and then let out a slow breath as he popped his N, thinking that perhaps the mutt had somehow gathered enough pissing courage to come and bother him again, and spoke out in a low grumble rather than the previous demonic roar. Fing mongrel, I thought I said to leave me the S. As he turned around in his seat, Naruto stared into Uchiha Itachi's Sharingan. X. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.